So I've called this talk Great Fire of Crediton 1743 and all that. It's a deliberate reference to those who've ever come across 1066 and all that, which, as you might recall, is that everybody remembers that one date, 1066, and people remember a sort of random jumble of other things about history. Yeah. There's some stuff they know, there's some stuff they think they know, and there's things along the way which they've picked up from all sorts of sources which may or may not be true. So what I'm trying to do today is to concentrate on the stories which are associated with the Great Fire of 1743 and think about where they come from and what they are and where they come from, if you like. Now, when we started on this project, we brought together a team of 4 people. There was myself, John Heal, who some of you will know, very much involved in Crediton history for a long time, Ellie Babbage, who's a genealogist, and Peter Child, who's an historic buildings expert. So between the 4 of us, we started to scope out this project and say, what can we bring to this? What is it that we know? Where are the gaps in our knowledge? That's the sort of first 2 questions. But you quickly lead off then into, so what is it we think we know? What are the little stories which have been bubbling around in our heads about this topic, which we've never really checked out? We've never checked, is that true? Have we got the right story? And always in those cases, you really, if you're doing serious research, you have to start looking for evidence. But the other question we asked ourselves at this stage was, what do people want to know? What's the population of Crediton and the area going to be interested in? I could burble on all day about history for historians, and most of you would be glazed over before now, you know. But so what we're trying to do is to get something which will interest people, which will take your attention and leave you thinking, wow, that was interesting, that was good. Now, in terms of our starting point, one of the things which is very noticeable about Crediton is that no one has ever written what I would consider to be a definitive history of Crediton. We have Mr. Venn, who some of you may have come across, 2 volumes, terrific amount of work he did, and he tried to cover the whole of Crediton's history. But in my view, it's very problematical what he wrote. First of all, his style is such that you think you're hearing about 1743 and all of a sudden you realise you're back in the Anglo-Saxon era. He kind of veers around periods of history without any obvious sort of reference points. But the other massive, massive problem he's left us with, he's got some terrific stories, but we don't know where they came from because he does not acknowledge his sources. So you can't go back to the source material and check it. There are 1 or 2 things. There's one thing I'll come to later on today, which is a great story. But I have to say, Venn says that because I've got no way of checking that what he says is true or if it's a bit embroidered. I don't think he made things up, but sometimes the way he presented his story, there are some things you think, actually, I'm not sure that would work like that. And unfortunately, I cannot get back to his source material. I'm going to keep trying. But at this stage, with stuff from Venn, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with Venn, as you might have realised already. Great stuff, but I'm not terribly confident about all of it, about the accuracy of it. So, one of the first things that people know, in inverted commas, about the Great Fire of Crediton was that it was the biggest fire since the Great Fire of London. And people heard that? Yeah. And all of that comes from, all of that spins out from a guy called Micaiah Togood, who was a minister at what was then the Presbyterian Church up on Bowden Hill. And he wrote a short account of the fire in the weeks following the fire. This was very sort of hot off the press stuff. And he said, this is precisely exactly what he said, a greater extent of ruin, no fire perhaps, since that of London, hath ever left behind it. So it's the biggest extent of ruin since the Great Fire of London. Perhaps. That's a sly little word to stick in there. I'm guilty of doing things like that myself sometimes, I have to say. But he's saying, it might be. I heard somebody say that. I heard somebody say nothing bigger than this since the Great Fire of London. That's an 80-year gap. London 1666, this one's 1743. There'd been an awful lot of town fires. There was a big town fire in Tiverton in 1731 of a similar size to the Great Fire of Crediton. But the important thing to think about is here's the local minister who's writing a story about the fire, trying to present the news, if you like, about the fire to a wider audience. And you have to say, where would he have got? How would he have been able to check an assertion like that? How would he have been able to demonstrate confidently that this was the greatest fire since the Great Fire of London? There wasn't Google in 1743. There were no fact checkers around. There were no massive news organisations where you could go to get that kind of information. So he's kind of saying it might have been. It's a really big fire, it's a really important fire, and just to give you some sense of scale, I'm going to say to you it's one of the biggest, perhaps, since the Great Fire of London. And it's that kind of demythologising of it that's really important. Have people been to the museum exhibition? Yeah? Some people nodding here. We do go in for our tableaus at the museum, and we've got this lovely one which took a lot of work, illustrating the other story which a lot of people have heard about the Great Fire of Crediton. It was all started because this is a Sunday morning, and there were two blokes. They were cooking their leg of mutton over an open hearth. They were playing cards and drinking at the same time, not paying enough attention. There was fat dripping from the cooking meat. It went into the fire. Fire flared up into the chimney. Chimney caught fire. Roof caught fire. The whole town ended up being destroyed. Now, where does that come from? Where does that story come from? Now, interestingly enough, Togood, the guy I said wrote at the time, doesn't mention this at all. There's another contemporary account. He doesn't mention that at all. The earliest reference I can find to it is in a pamphlet, is probably the best way to describe it, a brochure which was produced in 1852 here in Crediton. And to quote that one, it says, "The fire is said to have originated when a set of heathenish fellows were engaged in playing cards on a Sunday. A shoulder of mutton was being cooked as the stakes for which they were playing, and da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da." Right? So that's 1852, and that's over 100 years after the fire is the earliest reference I can find to that particular story. A chap called Alfred Edwards, I would love to have met Alfred Edwards. This was a man who was writing a history of Crediton in the 1870s, compiled copious notes in loads and loads and loads of notebooks, some of which have survived, others are still missing. But he never published. I think he died before he got his book in order, as it were. But his notebooks have survived, some of them, and there's a quote in one of them. He's actually telling us where he gets this. He says, "Thomas Madge tells me," don't know who Thomas Madge was, "Thomas Madge tells me that the Great Fire of 1743 broke out at the house of one Cowley, an innkeeper, where a party playing cards threw some of the dripping onto a leg of mutton. Cowley was never heard of again." Dark deeds, eh? So we got that same story about the chaps playing cards on a Sunday, leg of mutton, and all that stuff. But we now got a little bit more information that's crept in there about this character Cowley. And it's always fascinating when you go back to the original sources to find the things which are remembered and the things which are kind of put to one side. Now, Mr. Venn, who's writing in 1968, he says it originated in a house where a leg of mutton was being roasted for a card party when dripping splashed onto the open hearth. In a flash! He loved dramatising, did Venn. In a flash, flames were drawn soaring up the chimney and showers of sparks cascaded into the surrounding roofs. This prurient rash soon achieved its desire. Oh, spreading wide and embracing both sides of the street. So we've got the same story again, told in great drama. I'm bothered by his language. I don't know if you know that word prurient. It's not a word to talk about in polite company. It's a kind of obsessive behaviour which is far from being polite. And I do have to wonder what a prurient rash is. But this was Mr. Venn trying to dramatise the whole story, if you like. But he's repeating this story. He's picked it up from somewhere. I think probably Alfred Edwards. I think he's probably got access to Alfred Edwards' notebooks. And this is the story as it's come down to us today. I was interested when I was putting this talk together. I thought, was this reference to this guy Cowley, who was never seen again? Luckily, with modern research material available, we have this wonderful series of things called Victualler's Recognizances, which is basically the licence arrangements for alehouses, of which there were 48 in Crediton in about 1740. 48 alehouses and a dozen or so inns. And the licensees all went off to the Brewster sessions, in the quarter sessions in Exeter once a year, and paid their money to get a licence. The licence records exist for 1739. There's a bit of a gap then to 1743, and then it goes on to 1744. So 1739, there's nobody called Cowley appears there, but there's a Richard Cowley, who was an alehouse keeper licensed in 1744. And we also know from other records that Richard Cowley was a tenant at Fountain Court. Fountain Court is in behind what's now the Once Red bookshop, second-hand bookshop, yeah? And he was a tenant there, and there was an inn at Fountain Court at various points in the 18th century. I can't honestly tell you if there was one in 1744, but it seems more than likely that he was a tenant there in 1744, running an alehouse the year after the fire. So it's quite possible, I put it no more strongly than that somewhere between 1739 and 1743, he'd taken up a licence and was running an alehouse somewhere else in the town. And it may have been the one where the Great Fire started. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to demonstrate whether that's true or not, but think about that thing. You know, this story has come down that it was a man called Cowley, it was his pub, it was his alehouse where the Great Fire started. And that may be true. On the map, the place where the fire started is shown as Mr. Francis. Now, Mr. Francis was a maltster, so he probably owned the premises. He supplied the malt to the alehouse there, where they brewed their own beer. But who did the brewing and who the alehouse keeper is, we don't know. It doesn't tell us on the map. The other thing I've got to tell you about Richard Cowley while we're here, I only started researching this very recently, and his name crops up in relation to several assault cases which are presented at the quarter sessions during the 1740s. Because he appears quite a lot, I suspect he's there as a witness, where there's been a bit of a fracas in his alehouse, perhaps. Maybe he associates with ne'er-do-wells, I don't know. It's just possible in one of them he's engaged in apprehending someone. This is like from the summary information you can get on the online overview on the catalogue. So I've got to find out more about Mr. Cowley. I'm determined to find out more about him. Interesting character who seems to have had this contact with the fire. But you can get the point that all these little glimpses of information will come up with different aspects to the story, unexpected aspects to the story. The other thing you've got to remember, all of those commentators, all those people who've written stories about it, they all make the point about playing cards on a Sunday, which is a deeply sinful thing to do. The cards generally recognised in times gone by as the devil's picture book. And to be playing it on a Sunday, for people with a religious background was a wicked thing to do. And I think emphasising that, particularly in the Victorian era when Scraps of History and Alfred Edwards were writing, a very religious period, I think it's telling us more about people's attitudes and people's morality, if you like, than necessarily telling us about the hard facts. Yeah? It's just interesting. That kind of emphasis really is central to the story. So whether it was made up or whether it's just telling us what people thought was sinful behaviour, it's a kind of blend of both. So when it comes to this lovely map, have people seen the map? It really is absolutely spectacular. And one of the great things about the map is that it wasn't drawn for the purposes that we use it for now. It's drawn to represent the fire and to tell us about Crediton as it was immediately before and during the fire. But what we've tried to do, for the purposes of the exhibition, is, excuse me, to tell the story in a way which a lot of people will relate to. And we discovered the identity of the map maker and something about the process by which he came to do the map. And we created a little voice recording which you can hear at the museum, which I'm going to play to you now. Let me know what you think of this.
I saw it as a singular opportunity, a commission to make a survey and to draw a detailed map of a town. I was superintendent of the works for building the hospital in Exeter when I was approached by Mr. Tuckfield, one of the trustees. He said, "When you're finished here, could you take on a survey at Crediton? We need a skilled surveyor and cartographer. I've noticed your work, and I think you are just the man for the job." Well, I never imagined just how big a task this would be. I thought it would just be about the marketplace, but no, a map of the whole town was required. I leapt at the chance. I had learned cartography working with Mr. Richards, who generously encouraged me. I contributed somewhat to his drawings for the Exeter Hospital. He said I had much potential. So, in 1742, I spent many weeks in Crediton, taking measurements, making inquiries, and drawing sketches, oftentimes coming across local people who were very suspicious as to why I was drawing their properties and asking questions about encroachments. Then I had the job of drawing the very detailed map, all 5 sheets of it. I finished in the spring of 1743, and lo and behold, much of the town burnt down that August. So, much of what I had drawn, with so many details of those encroachments, no longer existed. My labours, it seemed, had been in vain. But no, my work now had an unexpected value. I was to annotate the map so as to create an exact depiction of what had been destroyed. Invaluable, it seems, for the purposes of the Relief Committee when they were distributing funds for rebuilding the town. They did not have to rely on conflicting memories of what stood where, how big each property was, whether it was cob or brick, thatched or slated. Here was the evidence, plain for all to see. Not that everyone agreed, they never do. And I noticed 1 or 2 places where I had left queries unresolved, or where I'd failed to include the name of a property holder. Just details, but details are what I pride myself on. I learned a lot from that job.
So there's William Chappell telling you all the story of how he came to be engaged. He was building what's now Dean Clark House in Southernhay, which was the original Exeter Hospital. He was indeed the superintendent of the works there. And Mr. Tuckfield, who was associated with the family that what's now Showbrook Park, was indeed one of the trustees. And I've deliberately said to you, I've imagined it was through that connection that he came to get this job. This sketch here is a shame you've got the blind spot today, Mark, because if you were to look out of that window, that was the scene you would have seen as it was in 1743. This is the house here on the corner of Bell Parade and Deep Lane going up that way. It's all now modern housing, of course, but this is from the sketchbooks which William Chappell, the map maker, did. And of course, then we have the thing, he draws this spectacularly detailed map. Most of what he drew burnt down, but then he came to annotate the drawings. So we've told the story sort of rather more fundamentally and flatly in the exhibition and at length in the book. And I've kind of dramatised it there, thinking that that will sort of focus it in the minds of another audience, if you like. The other amazing story we have coming from the contemporary accounts is the story of the man in the barrel, which some of you might be familiar with. And this comes from a contemporary account of a man who escapes his house, which has just started to be affected by the fire, only to find he's completely trapped in the road outside. He cannot get out of the area of the road that he's in, and ends up crawling into an empty barrel in order to stop himself being scorched. It gives me the shivers thinking about that, it really does. And Alan Murray, I don't know if any of you know Alan, he's a local designer and artist, and we asked him if he could draw us that depiction of the scene. But where does this story come from? So you're in the early days of newspapers in the 1740s, and there was a national magazine called the Gentleman's Magazine. Had a rather select audience, I imagine. And it was like a news digest. It came out once or twice a month. And in September 1743, there was an account of the dreadful fire at Crediton, which was the account which tells us the story about the man in the barrel. It's written as a first-hand account. I did this, I did that. It's anonymous. It's not. There's no name associated with it, with the writer, the person who went through this at all. But in his own words, he said, "We made several attempts, but we could not escape. I saw a half hogshead, a barrel, a half hogshead with its head out. I laid it along and crept into it, threw something over my legs and my thighs to keep me from the scorching heat. I was at Mr. Dyer's door, and Samuel Kingwell, one of the other people in this scene, amidst the street before our door. I thought on nothing but that I should be destroyed in that place." So we've gone into that barrel. I don't know if those of you who've been to the exhibition will know we've got a barrel with a sort of a mannequin inside it. I have to tell you, I crawled into that barrel when we got it, just to think, what was it like? And I'm not particularly claustrophobic. I think if you were claustrophobic, you'd have the EBGBs if you were in there and there was this danger going on around you. There was this possibility that he might not come out of that alive. I mean, it's seriously scary, dramatic stuff. But look, what have we got here? Within that account, we start getting some little details. We've got Mr. Dyer, whose house is part of this scene. A guy called Samuel Kingwell, who's involved in the story. And what we can find there is some extra detail to go on. Now, Mr. Venn, Major Venn, I beg his pardon, Major Venn calls this the narrative of Paddon the wigmaker. And I have no idea where he's got that idea from. Certainly a wig maker, the guy makes wigs or perukes, as they were called at the time, because he talks about saving his peruke making equipment. But why he's associated with the surname Paddon, I don't know. There certainly are Paddons in the town. There are Paddons very much involved in the serge making industry, which is a really big industry in the town at the time. And we've got a whole load of fire insurance records which mention Benjamin, Paddon, John, Mary and Thomas, but none of those fire accounts, which the fire insurance records are very detailed. You're insuring your house and you're insuring your possessions very often. So if you've got valuable possessions like the tools of your trade, it will nearly always tell you what trade you're in, or you'll be able to discern it from the list if you like. So we've got these people, we know they're serge makers, we know they're, in one case one was a weaver, but none of them make references to wig making. However, we do have a peruke maker, because Peter Cam, peruke maker, was a tenant at Chilston's tenement, coincidentally the same place as Richard Cowley was a tenant, is a little courtyard there, in the February of 1744. And then by the December of 1744, he had got back on his feet well enough with his business, his peruke making business, to insure a shop and his stock in trade. So we know there's this guy who had been a peruke maker, who got back onto his feet 18 months after the fire, and was insuring his stock in trade again. And there are other peruke makers around. There are references amongst other scattering of fire insurance records to somebody called Thomas Jope, William Pendlick and Richard Potter. So you take your pick. It's going to be one of those four peruke makers in the town. I don't know which one. I have no idea why Venn hit on the name Patton. Very strange though. The other thing we get is that because we've got those details from that first-hand account, we've got a pretty good idea of where that man in the barrel incident occurred. You've got to remember, with all these maps, they're kind of upside down. South is at the top, okay? So you're here, this is the place, I suspect a lot of people will know. Here the fire began. This is basically Lloyd's Bank, Charlesworth Nickel, thereabouts, okay? And you've got the museum over here. And in terms of modern roads, you've got Searle Street there, you've got St Saviour's Way coming down there, okay? This is the area of the High Street, which in those days was referred to as Broad Street. Very good reason. The High Street was in three parts. There was Lower Marketplace, there was Broad Street, which was broader, and then you had Narrow Street, which starts, where do I say Narrow Street starts? Just beyond the Congregational Church. It was much narrower than it is now. It was widened in the 1840s. But basically, what you've got is this dramatic story which happens. He escapes his house, as you recall, the man in the barrel. He escapes his house only to find he is one of a small group of people surrounded by flames. The reason he's surrounded by flames is not only were the houses both sides of the road on fire by this time, but down here you've got all the market buildings in the middle of the street. They were on fire as well. So you had this complete wall of fire down here. By the time you get up to here, the houses are close enough that you can't get through there again because you've got a wall of fire. So he's in this horrible arena, if you like, where it's broad enough that they can escape their own properties, but it's so hot that they are at risk getting scorched. They're not actually contacting the flames, but the intense heat is such that they're getting scorched. So we've got the arena within which it happens. And we've also got some of the characters that he mentioned. So you remember they talked about Mr. Dyer's door. Well, here's Mr. Dyer's house here. And it was very close to his own house. So I guess he lived somewhere along here. Don't know exactly, but somewhere along there. And he also makes references to Mr. Robert Francis's house, which is where the fire began. And he talks about someone running up as far as Elias Bishop's house and then not being able to find their way through any further than that. So we've got all these people. And next time you go along that kind of side of the street, something I really recommend you do, stand at the bottom of St Saviour's Way and look down this way, and you'll actually see the way that street curves around, because all these houses were rebuilt on the original footings. When it was rebuilt after the fire, it was very much in exactly the same shape as it is now. And you will get that sense of Broad Street. And just think about what that would have looked like, August the 14th, 1743. I think it's great, the way it's so rare that you get that amount of information available to you from something that happened nearly 300 years ago. And this is the one I've got to thank Mr. Venn for, Major Venn for. Saturday after fire, Saturday the 20th of August, 1743, the first market day in Crediton after the fire. The marketplace was in ruins. No fit place to do business. They wouldn't have been able to hold a market there even if they wanted. But this was the main commercial activity of the town. People had a living to make. People had things they wanted to buy and sell. Apart from anything else, you probably got a lot of your food from the market every week. So there was a real urge to actually get back to some kind of normality, if you like, to do some business. And I say, this story, I wouldn't have been aware of this if it were not for Major Venn. He tells a story of how there was an attempt to set up some temporary stalls, to set up a sort of one-off marketplace down in the East Town, part of the town, around the church, unaffected by the fire, beyond the reach of the fire. And this is directly a quote from Venn. Mrs. Chabon, farmer of the Tolls, tried to enforce the tariff. The temperature of the people, raw and on edge, was exacerbated. Now, if you'll forgive me again, I'm going to try and tell another story using another of our voice actors on here. So this is what we made of it.
The Saturday after the fire, I had a bit of a conundrum. I couldn't hold the market in the usual place. on account of all the stalls being burnt down and the street there not being in a fit state to do business. The best us could do was to fakey up some trestles and awnings and set up our stalls down in the East Town. Then Mrs. Ayres and Gracie Shaban appears with a couple of her bailiffs, one on either side, and says us all had to pay her the market tolls and dues as well. What a nerve that woman has. "These hidden your stalls, miss," says Edward Gribble, "so us don't owe you naught today. You owe me the usual stallage and piggage for the Saturday market," says she. "Stalls or no stalls, if you won't pay, you must pack up and go." There was a little knot of stall holders backing up Edward Gribble now. "Us have got to make a living," cries one. "And so have I," says she. "On behalf of me husband, farmer of the market, I demand that you all pay your dues or pack up and leave." I wondered what was going to happen next. Jack Tremlett, one of the bailiffs, went to tear down on one of the awnings, and that set off a bit of pushing and shoving. "Shame on you, Jack," says somebody, "you and that witch." Somebody said he could have borne his losses with patience if he could have seen her burning in the flames last week, which I thought was going a bit far. But she knew she was beaten and backed off, not without some jeering and catcalling from stall holders and onlookers, and her crying out that us all'd regret this when her husband got to hear of it. He'd make sure us all got our comeuppance. Next day, us found out her'd ridden off to Exeter, telling everyone that us had put her in fear of her life. "Good riddance," said Edward Gribble, "and let's hope we've seen the last of her."
I hope you like that one. I have to say I enjoyed writing that very much. And if you think the accent's not terribly authentic, it's an Exeter accent. Helen, who voiced that for me, came from Exeter, but I think she made a jolly good job with it.
Yeah.
And I mean, what a heck of a story, you know. So you've got this rather more upmarket lady who's trying to hold her own against the stallholders who are prepared to fight their corner against her, shall we say. So what we know is, again, we don't know where Venn got that information from. He goes into a bit more detail and he comes up with something which is a direct quote from somewhere. Where that somewhere is, I can't tell you. But it ends off saying, "These are the reasons she gives, reciting with all the clause in the law which she says provides for her against unavoidable calamities." This is her making a claim saying, I am still owed those tolls and I'm not able to collect them, therefore I've got to have some kind of compensation. So it's clearly some kind of solicitor's letter or thereabouts, I don't know. It's something in a legal process which is about her saying, you know, I've been unable to get anything out of these stallholders and I've made a financial loss out of this. So, you know, somehow I'm going to seek some recompense in all this. Fascinating. I mean, again, I've searched as far as I've been able to locally with this. I don't want to give up on this one because I just think she's a fascinating character. And she becomes even more fascinating when we start looking at the family. My starting point on this was just one phrase which comes up in Venn's record. She says she goes to collect the tolls, the captain not being at hand. And Venn puts a little asterisk against that and he says, Captain, query, bailiff? Would this normally be done by a bailiff and for some reason she's called him the captain? Well, what I've spent a lot of time looking at fire insurance records, far more than is truly healthy, I have to tell you. And I found one for a Captain Peter Chabon. And this is Mrs. Chabon who was collecting the tolls. So, and he was insuring this house here. This is a property slap bang in the middle of the marketplace. So this is, if I tell you this is now a spa shop and this is a hairdresser's, and back behind them there's James Antiques and the Tandoori. You know where I am in the high street, yeah? So this house, now a hairdresser's, was Mr. Jabin's house in 1743. So we've got this fire insurance record. We also know that he took out a sacrament certificate. A sacrament certificate is basically proving that you are a responsible person for public office. It doesn't say which public office. Sadly, he used a sort of pro forma thing, which just sort of says, yeah, he's all right. You know? But we know he was going for some kind of public office in 1740, which was quite possibly taking on the role of the farmer of the market. This is 18th century outsourcing. Lord of the manor owns the marketplace, but he doesn't want to collect the tolls himself. He sells an annual license to somebody who then collects it and takes all the takings. So this is how come Joanna Chabon, his wife, comes to be going around trying to extract all this money. How do I know she's called Joanna Chabon? Well, amazingly, and this really did become amazing at this stage, Ellie, who's our genealogist, found a newspaper article from 1894, 150 years later, referring to the unearthing of a tombstone in Crediton churchyard, a previously unknown tombstone, when a sexton was digging a new grave, which was partly obliterated, it had been under the soil for 150 years, but some part of that time. And it read that Joanna Chabon, the wife of Captain Peter Chabon of the 10th Dragoons, was buried here in 1752. Da-da-da-da-da-da. So we had the right person, and we had the link back to Captain Peter Chabon. We had this record of the 10th Dragoons. Now, anybody who's got any interest in military history will know that the internet is a terrifically rich source of military history. There are a lot of blokes who love to record as much as they can about military history on the internet. This man, I can tell you, Peter Chabon, who by 1745, the date of the Battle of Culloden, was Major Peter Chabon, commanded the 10th Dragoons at the Battle of Culloden. He had gone up in the world, but he was not at hand on August the 14th, 1743. He was probably off soldiering somewhere. But suddenly we've got all this information just from this little glimpse of information. It's not the only thing it tells us about Mrs. Chabon, though. Mrs. Chabon, this incidentally is the little sort of mannequin we've got for her at the museum. I think we've made a very good job of making her look quite posh. But what we know from her tombstone was that she died in 1752, aged 32. Now I had this image until we found this, of this lady of mature years with a sense of purpose about her, going out and doing this. She was 23 years old when she did that. Just a less. My gosh, did she have some nerve. I just think that's great. I mean, what a terrific human interest story. It's very rare when you come to this period of history to have many stories about women. Yeah, it's called history and not her story for a reason. People will tell you. But we have two lovely stories of two very different women who come across in here. Joanna Chabon, very much of what in the 18th century they would have called the middling sort, the middle classes, and a lady called Anne Hooks, who Anne Hooks comes from a very, very, very different background. And to tell you her story, we've got to go back to talking about the relief fund for a minute. So loads of people weren't insured against fire, so there was a public appeal for relief for the poor sufferers by fire in Crediton. Nationwide appeal. They sent this around to all over the country, and there were arrangements to pay in locally. All those goods would be collected, all those donations would be collected. They'd go to London, and from London they would arrive back in Exeter. And Exeter was the local point where the people who were running the relief fund could actually go and get their hands on the money. This is before banking, so there was something called bank post bills. Just think about cheques is the easy way to describe it. And they were delivered by post. And the first I found out about this story was a notice appeared in a national newspaper which says that the Exeter Mail was robbed on the highway in a very wild place called Turnham Green. I don't know if any of you know West London, but Turnham Green is now a tube station near Chiswick. But it was a notorious haunt of highwaymen in 1743. And on the 8th of February 1744, in this robbery, 16 bank post bills, underwrote for the use of the poor sufferers by fire at Crediton in Devonshire, were stolen. The whole amounting to £500. £500 was an immense amount of money in those days. And whosoever will bring those bills to Mr. William Hart at the Grasshopper in Fleet Street shall have 5 guineas reward. NB, payment of these bills is stopped at the bank. You're not going to get anything for the bills, but if you bring them in, you can have 5 guineas. Now, of course, what happens is if you're a person in the underworld, you probably won't have read this, and you probably won't know that the bills are valueless now. You're going to be trying to sell them on, aren't you, to somebody along the line. And this story goes on, because what happens is that the postboy who was robbed comes before the investigating magistrate, and he admits that he's not been stopped by a highwayman, he's been stopped by a highway woman. And initially they're a bit perturbed by this. They say, in a way in which is not proper for a chap like me to say, but why did you give up your mailbag to her? He said, well, sir, I thought she was going to draw a pistol on me. I suspect there was some of this going on. I got a gun in here, mate. You know. But whatever, he was not going to risk his life. He was going to hand over his postbag. And a few weeks later, a report appears in another newspaper which tells us that a lady called Anne Hawkes had been apprehended in possession of the stolen bills. And it says, there is no doubt, no manner of doubt, that she is the very person who committed that robbery, for which she is now committed to the new prison till she is re-examined next Thursday, when several particulars to corroborate the evidence against her are to be inquired into. Yeah, they've got a bang to rights, haven't they? You know, she was in possession of their goods. When this comes up for trial, yeah, we'll see justice done, won't we? Well, when it came to the trial, which was in September of that year, the case for the defence was put by Anne Hawkes's barrister, and she's got a good trick, as Anne Hawkes. She is there. Look at that woman with the child in her arms. Right, look, that's a great way of getting the jury on your side. Look at that woman, she says to Moses Brotherton, the postboy, with the child in her arms. See whether you think she is the person who robbed you. And Moses Brotherton said, well, I can't be positive as to the person. They had a crepe over their face, a wig, a mask over her face, and a long white wig on. And you take it upon you to swear that you thought it was the same voice? Well, I can't swear it's the same voice, sir. I said to Thomas de Vale that I thought it was the same voice. And the evidence started to unravel. You know, had they got the right person? You know, I mean, it's a serious point. You know, we think of justice as being pretty rough and ready in those days, but justice had to be seen to be done. They had to be sure they were going to, you know, if they got somebody they were going to hang if they were convicted, you had to be pretty sure you'd got the right person. And the case fell apart, and Anne Hawkes walked free. I'm always amazed when I think back on it that they didn't actually do her for possession of stolen goods, which she would have been banged to rights on. And I'm not sure what the punishment for that would have been. Probably transportation in 1743. But no, she walked free. So we've got the story there of two women, two very different women. And this has really only come about in the process of researching this project. So we got there, half a dozen different stories, 5 different stories if I'm correct. The origins of the fire, we now know more about that, the making of the map, and you know, the guy doing all the sketches and that stuff. The man in the barrel, he's in your stalls mess, down in the East Town with the market there, and the highway robbery. And you've got a much better picture now of where we've got solid evidence, where we've got things which are just a story, and with this stuff in between, yeah? And I suppose what I'll leave you with is the thought of how are people going to be telling this in 100 years' time? Yeah? Are people going to go away from today, from seeing the exhibition and reading our book, whatever, they're certainly going to be going away with a new understanding, but I wonder what they'll remember of it. I wonder how they'll tell those stories. Who's going to remember what's fact, what's based on fact, rather like those voice recordings I gave you. I can't say they're authentic in every detail. Those certainly aren't their words, but we base them around facts. And how much of it is really just a story. So that's me done. That comes to the end of that. I will tell you, as Mark said at the very start, we've got the museum exhibition on. It runs through until October, it runs through the end of the half term. Open every Wednesday, Thursday and Friday, 10 till 4, and Saturdays, 11 till 2. And we've also got a book, and thoughtfully I've even brought some copies, so you may buy one if you wish. But other than that, I'm yours for questions. Yeah,
Where are all the fire insurance records actually kept?
they're kept in the London Metropolitan Archive. Fire insurance was quite a new thing in 1743. It starts early 18th century, I think it's about 1710. And by the 1740s, it had taken off remarkably. There were only two companies selling fire insurance outside of London at that time, of whom by far the biggest was the Sunfire Company, still around now as Sun Insurance. And all of their records are kept in huge ledgers at the London Metropolitan Archive. And it ain't easy to search them because they're all written up in huge ledgers and they're written in as they arrive, in the sequence that they arrive. So you've got to go through the whole country's worth in order to find the ones which relate to Crediton. So I spent 3 solid days at the London Metropolitan Archive, enjoying myself very much. And all I was doing was to photograph each one which related to Crediton so that I could take them back afterwards. But I mean, they are amazing wealth of information. I've put a lot of the information into the book. There is also information on our database which we're building for the museum, so that you can actually see if there was one which related to any family that you're interested in. Very often you can't recognise the houses, you can't recognise the individual properties. We're talking about a period before we had house numbering, for example. So places are very often just known by the name of the property holder. Or in some cases, I mentioned one which is about Fountain Court, where there's a group of properties which have a collective name. But they are an amazing source of information.
The Sun Company, the company whose logo you still find on the sides of some buildings as having fire insurance?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so it's a sun in glory. So it's a sun with a face.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, yeah. We've actually got one now. Tiverton Museum, bless them, loaned us a couple of items for the exhibition, including an 18th century original Sunfire fire mark. Interesting story in itself, which I digress for good reason here. I guess a lot of you will have been told at some point in your lives, as I was, that you put a Sun fire mark, you can put an insurance company fire mark on your house, so that if your house was on fire and you had that, the insurance company's fire engine would rush along and try and put the fire out. Yeah, people heard that? Well, not true quite. Not in 1743. True in large cities and true later. But at this stage of history, provincial towns owned their own fire engines. If they had one, it was the town's fire engine, not the insurance companies. Crediton, we know, had one because Tocook relates to it in his account. So they were going to put out the fire wherever it was most dangerous. They weren't going to be bothered as to whether you had insurance or not. But the other thing we do know is that the Sun Fire Insurance Company also employed people who they referred to as porters. Strapping great blokes who, in the event of a fire, if you had insurance, would come and help you to carry your goods to safety. In their interest, because they weren't going to have to pay for them, in your interest, because you wanted to keep hold of your own possessions. So if you had a fire mark on your house, these guys would be saying, "You want help carrying that out, mate?" Very helpful. If you didn't have it, they weren't going to come to your house, or they were going to come to your house last of all, perhaps. So that's what fire marks seem to have been all about. Interesting little twist, and I had to go in and out to get that story out there. But there you go, there's an extra one. Yeah.
Where did they get the water to use the fire engine?
Oh, no, that's a lovely story in itself. Crediton had a huge problem with water supplies. The Great Fire of Crediton was in the August of 1743. Very much an echo of the Great Fire of London. It had been a long, hot summer. All the thatch on all the houses was bone dry, and there was a strong wind blowing. So, yeah, desperate search for water. On the map, we see at the western end, the St Lawrence Green end of Broad Street, there is the town pump. There is the town pump, singular, standing in the street. We know that there were wells in a number of the courtyards. In normal times, they would have been jealously guarded just for the use of the people who lived there. I suspect at times like this, it was, grab whatever you can, wherever you can. But no flowing water apart from the litter burn, which flowed more or less under this building, very close to this building somewhere, but was the town's open sewer. Not the best place to get your water from, but in an emergency, you probably went for that as well. Grab that into buckets. You've got some kind of fire engine, which there was a town fire engine because Tokod relates to it, and you pour as many buckets of water in as you can, and you pump like crazy, and try and get a hose playing on the buildings. Totally inadequate when it came to this. So great shortage of water, and when it was available, frankly, not an awful lot of good. But yeah, so I mean that all contributed really to the spread of the fire and the extent of the devastation.